Democrats in the American Joint Economic Committee have released a report raising concerns about declining Canadian visitors due, they say, to President Donald Trump's actions. The report says the negative impacts of President Trump's tariff policies have been particularly stark in states along the U.S.-Canada border.
Under the surface of Washington's political noise, something deeply uncomfortable just surfaced, and it wasn't supposed to. For months, the story coming out of the U.S. was confident, almost smug. Tariffs would work. Pressure would force compliance. Canada would bend. Instead, the opposite happened. And now, the most damning admission isn't coming from Ottawa. It's coming from inside the United States itself. This moment didn't begin with a speech or a dramatic announcement. It began quietly, the way real shifts of power usually do. While American officials were busy defending tariffs and promising strength, something subtle started changing north of the border. Canadians didn't protest. They didn't riot. They didn't flood social media with outrage. They simply adjusted their behavior. Border trips slowed. Spending patterns changed. Tourism choices shifted. What looked like indifference was actually discipline. And now the consequences are visible in black and white. When members of the U.S. Congress released their economic findings, the message was impossible to spin. Border communities were hurting, tourism was collapsing, small businesses that relied on Canadian visitors were bleeding revenue. Ferry routes were down sharply, border crossings dropped by nearly 1/5 in some regions. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't partisan rhetoric. This was an official acknowledgement that the strategy meant to hurt Canada was inflicting measurable damage on the American economy instead. That admission alone should have been shocking. But what made it seismic was what Canada had already done by the time Washington caught on. While the U.S. was still arguing about tariffs, Mark Carney's government was already operating on a different timeline. There were no dramatic retaliatory speeches, no chest-thumping announcements, no emotional escalation. Instead, policy moved quietly, deliberately, and with long-term consequences. Canada didn't try to win the argument. It changed the structure of the game. The Buy Canadian policy wasn't framed as a counterattack. That's what made it so effective. It didn't accuse. It didn't threaten. It simply redirected power inward. Federal contracts that once flowed naturally to American suppliers were restructured to prioritize Canadian companies, Canadian materials, and Canadian labor. Infrastructure spending became an engine of domestic strength. Defense procurement turned into a tool of sovereignty. Government purchasing power, one of the largest in the country, was weaponized without ever looking like a weapon. And this is the part Washington underestimated. For decades, American policymakers assumed access to U.S. markets was leverage enough to keep allies compliant. The idea that Canada might intentionally reduce its reliance on American supply chains was treated as unrealistic, too costly, too disruptive, too risky. But risk changes when trust collapses, and Trump's tariff strategy didn't just introduce economic pressure, it shattered assumptions of reliability. Once that trust was gone, the calculation changed completely. Canadian businesses stopped planning around guaranteed U.S. access. Provincial governments accelerated alternative trade relationships. Europe and Asia moved from secondary markets to strategic priorities. Supply chains adjusted, investment flowed in new directions, and most critically, Canadians themselves stopped behaving like customers who needed American approval. This wasn't nationalism fueled by slogans. It was nationalism expressed through choices. Meanwhile, American border towns were left exposed. Their economies had been built on a quiet reality Washington rarely acknowledged. Canadian goodwill, weekend shoppers, summer tourists, seasonal visitors who crossed the border without thinking twice. When that movement slowed, there was no backup plan, no replacement market, no emergency switch to flip. The loss was immediate and the pain was local. That's why governors started panicking. That's why mayors spoke openly about the damage. And that's why Congress eventually had no choice but to admit what was happening. The trade war didn't force Canada back to the table. It pushed Canada away from it. And here's where the story becomes even more uncomfortable for Washington. By the time the congressional warning arrived, the damage was already locked in. Contracts had been signed, procurement rules had been rewritten, domestic production had gained guaranteed demand. These aren't policies you undo with an apology. They reshape incentives for years. Even if tariffs disappeared overnight, the logic behind Buy Canadian wouldn't vanish. Canada had already learned the lesson Trump unintentionally taught. Dependency is vulnerability. This is the quiet brilliance of Carney's approach. He never needed to attack Trump personally. He never needed to escalate rhetorically. He let outcomes speak. While American politics stayed trapped in cycles of reaction and counter-reaction, Canada focused on insulation. Economic insulation, political insulation, strategic insulation, and the results now speak louder than any speech. American lawmakers are warning about losses. Canadian policymakers are locking in gains. U.S. businesses are pressuring Washington to repair relations. Canadian industries are adjusting to a future where U.S. access is optional, not essential. The balance of leverage has shifted, not dramatically, not overnight, but decisively. This is why the congressional warning matters so much. It's not a turning point for Canada. Canada has already turned the page. It's a warning for the United States about what happens when power is mistaken for permanence, when intimidation replaces partnership, when short-term political theater overrides long-term economic logic. Trump's plan relied on a simple assumption that Canada needed the U.S. more than the U.S. needed Canada. That assumption is now being dismantled piece by piece, not by Canadian propaganda, but by American data. And perhaps the most revealing detail of all is this: Americans are still welcome in Canada. Tourism flows north haven't collapsed. Visits continue. Demand remains strong. The door was never slammed shut. Canadians just stopped walking through it in the other direction. That asymmetry tells you exactly who adjusted, who adapted, and who miscalculated. What we're witnessing isn't retaliation, it's evolution. Canada didn't win by fighting harder. It won by planning longer. It didn't answer chaos with chaos. It answered instability with structure. And now, as Washington scrambles to understand why its pressure campaign failed, Canada is already operating in a system designed to succeed without American approval. That's the real warning buried inside the story. Trade wars don't just create winners and losers. They create new habits, new alliances, and new definitions of strength. And once those are in place, they don't disappear when the headlines fade. The United States just learned that lesson the hard way. Canada learned it quietly and turned it into policy.